Yeah, so my name is James Hale. I'm a postdoc at Colorado State University. I work with a group here called the Regional Food System Research Network, and the research I'm going to be talking about today comes out of that. A little bit more about my background. I actually was a postdoc in New Zealand as well at the University of Otago, working at the Center for Sustainability. And I graduated from Colorado State University, so I've returned back to where I grew up and work with a number of folks here. I have to make a disclaimer. I prepared for a 15-minute presentation today, actually. That was the original message I got. So it's going to be, I'll be able to take my time, as Ian was saying, but I hope that will leave us more time for conversation and discussion at the end, and would welcome any thoughts that you all want to talk through more, either with me or each other, as far as what this brings up for everybody. So, I'm a sociologist, so I have to make sure that is known. 1 second, there we go. And I'm working with this interdisciplinary team and sort of providing social science support around food system sustainability efforts. And as part of this, we've become really interested in how place is enacted in practices that aim to achieve sustainability goals, such as developing and deploying sustainability standards. So today I'm going to be talking about some of the key takeaways from some work that was recently published in Frontiers in Sustainable Food Systems, with a particular focus upon various conceptions of place and processes that may help create more accountability and standards. As part of this broader effort at Colorado State University, we were working to model how changes in urban food procurement in Denver impact regional food system development, specifically rural wealth creation. And so rural wealth creation being, how it affects farmer income, but then the development of infrastructure or social relationships, the development of more natural capital and things like this. So it's a broader understanding of rural wealth creation. It is funded by the Foundation for Food and Agriculture, and we've been working in partnership with a variety of entities, including the Center for Good Food Purchasing program, or the Good Food Purchasing, and then also the City and County of Denver. The folks in Denver have been really interested in how the Food Policy Council can create policies that lead to more sustainable food systems. And this is something that often places value on local and regional procurement and working to achieve sustainability. So the council has been working to encourage the adoption of the Good Food Purchasing program. And our team used this development as an opportunity to model how such programs impact regional food system development. And that we focus upon a number of commodities, including wheat, peaches, potato, and beef. And the idea is that the agent-based model could be used to, once we filled it out, we could run different scenarios and be able to show trade-offs and who wins and loses, or what wins and loses within those various scenarios, and use this to help shape policymaking processes. The Good Food Purchasing program is made up of 5 core values, including environmental sustainability, local economies, nutrition, valued workforce, and animal welfare. Each of these are made up of certification programs that you can get a variety of different points from. So it might be fair trade, certified grass-fed, USDA organic, things like this. And they also have their own indicators, such as distance to farm or ranch. And all of these indicators are assigned points that are then used to characterize a procurement agency's particular procurement practices. And it really theoretically assumes that there'll be some sort of ratcheting up effect where participating institutions that are ahead will want to stay ahead, and laggards that will want to catch up with those that are ahead. It was developed in a multi-stakeholder process in Los Angeles, and is currently being adopted within quite a few cities across the United States. I just wanted to step back for a moment and ask this question: what are standards exactly? One definition that I like is that they're the indicators and measures by which people, practices, processes, and products are assessed. The trouble with this is that they're often fallible and problematic. So for example, they may not actually get at what they intend, or they have unintended consequences, or can be seen as exercises in power and disciplining. So for example, we might look at something like the USDA organic certification, and many have argued that the way this standard has actually been enacted over time has eroded the original goals. So I talk to farmers that describe how they have to till more, and this leads to control weeds, and this can lead to outcomes that are problematic from a sustainability point of view. From our position, though there are many challenges, we take a performative and pragmatic orientation towards the standards. So this means that we view them as that they're not going away, and they're best to be viewed as processual. So the limitations of standards really push scientists to examine their own role in the construction of these standards and their reproduction, and ask what kind of standards do we want to enact? How do we want to, what's the impact that we want to have? And these current concerns can place a critical lens on standards, but it also pushes us to enact alternatives. So here's a few standards of place, just as examples. We have some, as I mentioned earlier, that the Good Food Purchasing Program encourages, are things like the distance that food travels as one way to reduce carbon or energy use, or encourage local economies, or things like that. There are standards related to government boundaries, whether it be municipal, county, state, national. There are also sustainability management standards enacted within particular places, such as standards that require water use or nutrient leaching management or stocking rates. And these are often aimed at particular characteristics of place related to bodies of water or characteristics of soil. And there's many others, and I'm not advocating for any of these. I'm just describing some of the ones that are commonly out there. And really, these various standards of place are really reflective of different conceptions of place. And we argue that place can be understood from a biophysical perspective, a political managerial, a political economic perspective, and a cultural perspective. So biophysical conceptions of place include things like landscape, or soil, hydrology, weather patterns, terrain, and biota. Political includes government boundaries, property ownership, economic relationships, and cultural conceptions of place include things like identities and histories, essentially a sense of home or belonging. And one thing that was interesting when we were working together on this as an interdisciplinary team is how each discipline sort of has its own orientation towards these things. And so, for example, as a sociologist, a lot of times we might end up thinking more about these latter two, of things like culture and political economic boundaries, whereas some of the folks on the team that were ecologists were more focusing upon biophysical. So this was something that was sort of fruitful, I think, that came out of this work, is that we were able to try to talk through and work through these various conceptions and how we might be able to move standards forward. So our conception of place really looks at all of these as contributing to place's practice. And so this refers to not only what people do within a place, like the biophysical constraints, but also recognizes how place is constructed within social, economic, and political practices, which may transcend biophysical boundaries. Place is connected to how people think and feel about place, and these forms of meaning may not always be tied to particular locales. So, for example, standards are often taken up and plopped somewhere else based upon how some people may think about a particular place they're in, disregarding how others may think about or feel about that. In this way, as Camus put it, place isn't just something that people know and feel, it's something that they actually do. It's something that's enactive. And standards are one way that it gets done, and we're interested in improving the way that they're enacted. So here's a few examples of how livestock can be understood in terms of place. So you have the biophysical, there's variations in appropriate grazing frequency between New York State and Colorado, for example. Or there's political county level boundaries. So within Colorado, there's bioregional differences and different practices within counties around how, managerial practices. And this differs between the Western Slope and the Eastern Slope in some ways. These boundaries also exist culturally in terms of identity and histories. For example, where there's variation in cultural characteristics and legacies between Western Colorado and the Eastern Plains. Specifically, there's more institutional infrastructure, such as large corporate meatpacking plants in the northeastern part of the state, which results in different cultural characteristics versus the Western Slope, where ranches are smaller. They're surrounded by outdoor tourism industries, such as skiing, and it creates sort of a different cultural and political economic landscape. So returning to the GFPP from this place as a sort of a processual practice, there are a number of issues that we find with using the GFPP as a way to improve urban food procurement and also create rural wealth. Specifically, these standards were developed in Los Angeles with policymakers, researchers, school procurers, distributors, and farmers. And we argue this process in and of itself may have actually led to more trust and buy-in in the standards across groups. They're better able to incorporate cultural aspects of place into the standards, for example. And we posit that this is because, really a lot of the farmers that we've talked to in Colorado are really critical and resistant to a lot of these standards. And see them as just another attempt of urban elites to control what they're doing. So, for example, I observed one farmer at a conference confront a GFPP, the Good Food Purchasing Program representative, publicly, and expressed a lot of disappointment around the animal welfare standards, where they said that it was insulting that people would accuse them of not caring for their animals and having never been to their farm, or having potentially not stepped on a farm in their life. So given that these standards were developed with farmers, but in a different place, the process of constructing place and standards may be just as important as the standards themselves in achieving favorable outcomes. So we make a number of suggestions regarding how to better work towards place-based standards. One area we draw from is the community readiness literature, which suggests engaging broad, diverse audiences who are exposed to quality information and a willingness to consider multiple perspectives, aiming to ensure genuine opportunities for those audiences to work through inherent tensions, trade-offs, paradoxes of issues, and values ongoing collaborative and complementary actions that allow for productive responses to those tensions. One sort of tool we suggest could be asking a variety of questions around these different conceptions of place and the various domains of them. So, by incorporating these things into good democratic processes, we think that this could lead to a more inclusive policy development process and inform the GFPP in a way that could lead to more effective standards. So here's some questions that could be used to help spark some of that conversation. So, as far as boundaries, you would have this sort of process of talking through the various biophysical boundaries and political boundaries, economic boundaries, and sociocultural boundaries as it's tied to a place, and then also the various flows for each of these. And we kind of think that this might get at some of the tensions that are sort of underground or that folks aren't particularly talking about, and could lead to more constructive standards that people can end up agreeing upon. And there might have to be obviously concessions to that process. Here's some other suggestions we made in this piece. So being intentional about the process by which standards are developed and implemented. Exclusionary shortcuts will often lead to standards not being as effective. effective standards are credible and recognizable. So standards have to make sense and really seem reasonable for folks within their biophysical, political, economic, and cultural landscape. It's important to embrace rather than ignore trade-offs within standards. So we often want them to achieve everything and to be perfect, but trade-offs exist more often than not. And we suggest that these are embraced as part of an ongoing effort to continually improve standards rather than idealistically ignoring the existence of trade-offs. And then working to integrate various aspects of place into practice, where we found that standards implicitly or explicitly get hung up on particular conceptions of place and ignore others. And this often severely limits their ability to enact sustainability goals. So that's pretty much all I have today. And as I said, my disclaimer at the beginning, I prepared for a little bit shorter than I was expecting this to be. So here's just some of the references. And I was hoping that, I just added a slide as we were talking earlier, since I realized I didn't prepare as much. But I'd be really curious to hear from you all about what this brings up for you, or specific examples or challenges that you have to what I've described today. And I guess I'll leave it there for now. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. No problems at all around the time you've taken. It gives us plenty of opportunity for a conversation, and also hopefully not just directed at you, but also across the 15 other participants that are here. Now, as I'm the chair of this, I will take the first question. So one of the characteristics that wasn't in your list was spirituality. I mean, for many of the systems, and that includes the conversations that we were having earlier around the Sami people or the Aboriginal people in Australia, spirituality is an important part of place, and it contextualizes a lot of the relationships that people have, even if they're dislocated from space, about the way in which they view place and space. So I wonder if that ever came up in the conversations that you had around the good food standards that you had, because it is apparently missing from what I would have expected to see.
Oh, thanks for that, Ian. I completely agree. And it didn't come up in direct conversations, but through sort of our secondary analysis and some of actually what we're working on right now, there are some things that tie a little bit more to spirituality with place. And part of the way that I think about that is it kind of falls under that cultural aspect. Like there's quite a bit of overlap between sort of cultural identity and representations and things like spirituality. But I do see like how you can, all of these you can break out into further bits, and but yeah. I wish I was at that talk last week to hear about that.
Yeah, I was. So if you have a question, can you please put up your hand? And since I don't see any yet, I will ask another question, which comes more to the nature of the academic process. So you talked about the fact that your group is an interdisciplinary group, and you had a range of different academic disciplines that were involved. One of the challenges that I've found is one of the challenges I've found is the nature of the conversation, in that often they go in parallel rather than intersecting because of the use of language. And so I would like to hear about your experience and how you've overcome some of that. But it isn't just challenges. I've found incredibly useful as an ecologist, having people that come from the social science background who ask questions that are things that I wouldn't have even thought of. So in your case, the idea of what does community mean you know, in the context of the kind of work that you're doing. So just some reflection on this, on the academic process of the interdisciplinarity that you see within the team that you got, both challenges and the things that have been surprising to you coming from your disciplinary background.
I really appreciate that very much, and it's something I think about a lot, and I'm sure a lot of other people here on the call do as well, that the more grants that come out, or just the shift is to really try to work on more interdisciplinary projects. So this is something that I continually am faced with. And currently what I've found through the last 5 or 6 years of working on these broader teams is that it really takes time and consistent effort of trying to build trust and building personal relationships with people. I think at first, myself included, in different conversations, it could be a little hard where folks are trying to sort of carve out their place on a team and what they have to offer. And sometimes with social science, people have a particular idea about what a social scientist is going to do. So one thing that commonly comes up is that social scientists are supposed to kind of create behavior change or adoption. So we know what needs to happen, is what some people will say. Now we just need social scientists to make it happen.
Yeah.
And sometimes for social scientists, that can be pretty hard, because it's assuming that experts or academics know what needs to happen within a particular place. So to tie it back to the place link, sometimes academics will make assumptions about what needs to happen, but then maybe aren't thinking about these cultural or spiritual things in the same sort of way. So, social scientists might be more interested in going out and talking to folks and learning about, their conceptions of place and how that might challenge things like standards. And sometimes that can be challenging on a research team to sort of say, like, well, the way we were thinking about these standards of place actually maybe needs to significantly change when you really go talk to the people. So that's one thing. And another thing as a social scientist is we tend to think about systems that are, depending on your orientation, it's not just about an individual. It's about groups or larger systems and culture. And those things are a little bit more contentious and difficult to model. There's less agreement even within the social sciences about those things, and it can create sort of a fuzziness. But what I tend to argue is that that uncomfortableness is actually a really important thing for social science to try to bring into this type of work as much as they can, and it is really what we have to offer. So I guess to tie back, like my biggest thing is trying to work across time with folks to build trust, to learn from them, and also hope that they'd be able to learn from me and have that translation end up happening through language and whatnot. But I'd be really curious to hear any other folks' thoughts on that question. I'm fascinated by it, and so again, thanks for asking it.
We'll come back to that one in a minute. So I've got Anne Stephen has got a question that she's done on the chat, and then Murph, you'll be next after that. So Anne, do you want to ask your question?
I think I can glean it from the chat, and this is a really good question, and it's a very difficult one for me to really answer. And we struggled with this often when we're working on this paper, that in a particular place, essentially, that people can be living there that it's not that everybody agrees upon what should happen, that are all living in a particular place. There are different generations, there's different cultures, and so on and so forth. Different industries that some of their perspectives can be at odds with each other. And so this is, I almost process more as part of like a more wicked problem. It's around change and how change occurs, winners and losers and how those are determined and shaped. And it's sort of a cop-out, but essentially the way I process it is the most that we can have inclusive processes for civic engagement and in the process of the development of standards, the better. And hopefully you'd be able to include folks that are older residents so that they have buy-in and they feel like they're not being left out, and vice versa. But I also recognize how that's often easier said than done. And I'm not trying to make some sort of claim that everybody can win.
Okay, thanks, Anne. Hopefully that answers your question. Murph?
Hi, thank you very much for that talk, James. My question is around the potential for outcomes-focused standards versus input versus focused standards being able to cope with the variations in place. So by input standards, I'm talking about things like organics that restrict what you can do. So they say you can't use agrochemicals, for example, where an outcomes-focused standard says we want to improve biodiversity, we want to improve soil health, we want to improve these. Have you looked at how those kinds of different approaches to standards can deal with place?
I haven't, Charles, thanks for asking that. I actually haven't really thought very much, or in our paper, we weren't really focused upon this distinction that you made between outcomes and input place standards. But is there anything, I guess I just turn back to you, like I'd be curious, like, is there anything that comes to mind for you as far as the difference between those related to place?
I mean, to me, it kind of seems like a fairly obvious thing that these kind of highly restricted input standards, they just can't cope very well with context. And organics, again, which I'm very familiar with, you know, the standards are based around a North European farming system and typically a mixed farming model. And then when those standards get transported to places like Australia or the rangelands of the United States, they're about a completely different farming system, you know, let alone peoples and all the rest of it. And we've had, you know, major issues and discussions in organics about, you know, how do we adapt standards for location? And we've never really kind of figured that out, and kind of standards are kind of now set in stone, so, you know, they can't be changed. Whereas I look at something like the FAO SAFA standard, you know, with that more outcomes focused and allowing the people in the system to actually kind of set, you know, their own aims and goals. To me, inherently, there's a lot more flexibility. And also, as you said at the beginning, you know, sometimes standards have perverse effects. We're wanting to achieve a particular outcome, but you end up with something else. And so again, you know, if the standard says the aim here is to improve soil health, and then gives a series of measures, you know, within that to say, you know, here's a bunch of targets, go for it. You know, that inherent flexibility seems to me much more likely to be able to deal with place than fixed, you know, input standards.
That definitely makes sense. And some of my co-authors on that paper, I think, actually were kind of getting at some of those issues, maybe without that clear distinction between the difference between input standards and output standards, which I really think that's very valuable and important, like you said. There can be more commonality across output standards across place, in a sense, is what I'm here you'd be saying, but the inputs and the processes to actually get to those outputs could be different. It's really important to recognize that. So that absolutely makes sense to me. I think it's a really important point.
I think that Murph raises a very important point here in terms of, you know, from a food systems perspective, how important is it that we look at the outcomes from these standards, rather than necessarily the inputs or the processes by which we get to those outcomes, you know? So we might look at nutritional outcomes, or we might look at animal welfare outcomes, so it's not as easy for us to be able to necessarily describe the exact processes and inputs, but the outcomes are things that ultimately I think are the things we are interested in, and we're making assumptions about those outcomes if we focus in on the inputs.
Yeah, there's a project here that finished a few years back now called, it was a big 7-year project, multidisciplinary, multi-centre, etc., called the New Zealand Sustainability Dashboard Project. And it was essentially about building computer systems based around the FAO SAFA standards to help industries actually measure their levels of sustainability. And so it was very outcomes focused. And as part of that, they actually looked across a number of sustainability standards globally across many agricultural industries. And there appeared to be a trend to move from these input focused standards like organics towards more outcomes type of standards. But there wasn't enough data to say the trend was real. But you know, I'd certainly agree with you, Ian. To me, you know, in organics, what we are fundamentally interested in is the outcomes. You know, we want to improve soil health, we want to improve animal welfare, we want to improve, you know, farming livelihoods and farming communities. But we do sometimes have these perverse outcomes. You know, one of the things I pick up regularly is a lot of the times in intensive horticultural cropping organic systems, they completely destroy soil health. They just destroy soil. It's just, you know, just horrendous, some of the stuff I've seen on some organic farms. Where with a more of an outcomes focused system, you'd just be going, we're kind of agnostic to how you get there, but what we want to see is reduced ag chem. We want to see, you know, improved soil health, these kinds of things.
Yeah, so genetically modified organisms are an interesting one here. And I used to run thing called the James Hutton Institute in the UK, and you know, we did a lot of work on potatoes and the ways in which we could genetically modify potatoes in order to make them less susceptible to Phytophthora. And you know, we had big pushback because of the fact that people would say, oh well, you know, you're using a genetically modified potato. However, it would mean that you'd move from maybe 7 sprays a year of a fungicide, fungicide to 3, right? And that would have much lower impacts on the environment. So, you know, those are the challenges where people just assume that the input, as in a genetically modified organism, is not conducive to an environmental outcome, right? Whereas it can be. So, I mean, did James? What did GMO come in to the conversations that you had in your food system stuff?
Not so far, but I did want to tie back with the organic conversation. You know, in Colorado, there's a lot of wheat growing, and I go interview wheat growers quite a bit. And this outcomes point that Murph talked about is really relevant to what they bring up around. Organic growers will say, you know, it'd be great to just be able to use some spray, some chemicals strategically sometimes on some areas so that they didn't have to till it as much. And I was going and talking to conventional and organic growers about a variety of different things. And conventional growers would say that they were better stewards because they weren't tilling as much. So they didn't have as much, you know, release of greenhouse gases. Whereas, you know, folks that were organic growers, they saw themselves as not using spray. And so it was all around this standard of the way input is being understood and how that kind of creates these unintended consequences on outputs. And so, yeah, I mean, if it was more output focused around, you know, good or land use practices or sustainable land use practices and how those are adapted to particular places, it might be a little bit different, you know, where maybe it does make sense to use spray sometimes in these particular cases. So yeah, that definitely makes sense to me. But yeah.
I mean, there's an interesting example here in New Zealand. So the regenerative ag thing's taken off in the last few years here in New Zealand. And one of the tensions we have between organics and the regen is around that issue of tillage. And the regenerative guys, who are also heavily focused, many of them on no-till or minimum till, and they say, yeah, we're better off using a small amount of Roundup glyphosate to allow us to go through and do no tillage compared to the organic guys. And the organic guys turn around and kind of go, yeah, but you're still using agrochemicals. So that there's a real fault line, you know, between those two systems here in New Zealand around that very issue, on which is the better one to do.
I presume that you need to have some kind of idea about what the inputs are, because you have to look at the ways in which monitoring happens in order to be able to achieve the outcome. It's a theory of change kind of idea, you know. And so what are the things that you're monitoring to say, okay, you are heading towards this particular standard?
Yeah, and particularly around biodiversity, this was one of the things in the dashboard project. You want to go and measure farmland biodiversity, you know, good luck. It's really expensive and difficult. And this, to me, this
the number mean?
Yeah, exactly. You know, because you talk about biodiversity, it's a great general concept. When you actually start getting down to specifics, you're kind of going, right, is all biodiversity in that? Well, it's probably the most important biodiversity there is. But you know, a lot of people would just think about, you know, particularly in New Zealand, how many native birds and plants have we got kicking around the system? But I mean, to me, that's one of the things with an input-based system. They're easy to measure and police. You know, it's kind of, have you used these products? Yes or no? You know, you're either in or out. And I'm thinking another good comparison is the nitrate pollution management, and the EU has taken the position of an input focused. You know, they say maximum application of 175 kilos, I think, of nitrogen per hectare per year out of the bag, out of the back end of the animal, and out of the shed. Very easy with a clipboard to go around and measure that. New Zealand has taken an outcomes focus, and we're using a model called Overseer to model farm nitrate leaching. It's ghastly complicated. And every time, of course, they update the models, everybody's numbers change. So yeah, when you say, what does this number mean? Well, it means a lot of different things just when they change the model. You know, no change in the actual data. The model changes, the outcomes change. So yeah, the outcomes is probably harder to police in many aspects.
So James, can I bring you back to one of your slides, which was the one on boundaries? I mean, I think within a standards context, boundaries can be a very difficult thing to define. So can you just give us examples of what you mean by the boundaries that you had? And I know you talked about boundaries for the particular levels or criteria that you had, but can you give us some examples just so that we can picture what you mean and how those might relate to the kind of circumstances that we're thinking of? Yeah,
I mean, I think that boundaries are a very tricky thing, particularly once you get into the sort of cultural aspects of boundaries. You know, it's a little bit easier, like a county or a state has particular, it's set, you know, they can be contentious, and you know, a lot of times rightly so, but at the cultural boundaries are much more difficult, or spiritual boundaries, or to go to your example from earlier, much more difficult to put into place, let alone the flows between the two. So I go back to one thing that I commonly make the case of, that I believe that there's a lot more opportunity for civic engagement and continued processes of bringing folks together to work on these issues, and the boundaries and flows are determined through those processes. You know, this goes back to something I mentioned earlier. You brought up around social sciences and working interdisciplinarily. Recently, I was working on some stuff and came across an article that showed that 770% more funding goes to the non-social sciences around addressing sustainability issues, or researching sustainability issues, particularly climate change. But most people will agree that we have the technology, or we have methods to figure out what we need to know and how we can get to know them, but it's a social problem. And so there's this issue that a lot of times we think that it's going to be some sort of technological fix, or there's going to be these short, fixes, but it's really the process of civic engagement and working across groups in society that is the missing piece that everybody recognizes, or a lot of people recognize as actually being the problem, but then we don't actually put the money there to to figure it out. So in some ways, it is like an issue around the way money moves within society and disciplines and research. And I think there's a lot of opportunities in the boundary making process for us to really do it right. The specific engagement and planning for it and enacting it needs a lot more support.
Yeah, so if you look at your boundaries, so I'm an ecologist, so I look at and I talk about a farm does not sit in isolation from its locale context. So that we're back to the place, and so water flows in and out, above ground, below ground. Nutrients move in and out of the system. Pollutants move in and out of the system, both across land through water flow, but also into the air. What is place from an ecological point of view, and from the community point of view, as you quite rightly say, the boundaries are defined by the people who you have inside the tent, right? And inside the tent means bring into the conversation. So from an animal welfare point of view, do you bring Animal Liberation Front into the conversation? Because they can actually be quite difficult to have a conversation with, because they're very strongly advocacy or single issue focused.
That's a really difficult question, and it's a very good one. We struggle with it in a variety of different ways here in Colorado, and I can definitely imagine it's like this issue. If there's nothing that people can potentially agree upon, or they are single issue, like you mentioned, then it can create significant challenges. Yeah, I don't have an easy answer for that. I'm sorry.
No,
It's a great point.
You're doing well, and we've got about 12 minutes left. Murph, do you want to just bring us up to speed on where New Zealand's at? You talked about the sort of big mega project. Have you moved on from there?
So yeah, the
the
sustainability dashboard project wound up. It was an interesting piece of work, because it was, it had some very lofty goals about essentially each industry would have a system that would collate on-farm data, aggregate it, at regional and industry level, and then in theory we could pull all that data together at a national level, and so actually give almost kind of real time, to the kind of weeks kind of timescale data of where New Zealand farming is at in terms of its sustainability. And so it did use the SAFA, the FAO SAFA framework to develop the system of measurement. And certainly some areas were, really quite easy to do, but, some of them, like biodiversity, were just ghastly. We never really got a handle on it in the end. So I think there were a lot of valuable lessons learned out of the thing, but and some industries have carried on with those systems, but others have fallen by the wayside. And again, it's unsurprisingly in New Zealand, we have a very skewed agricultural system in New Zealand, because it's so heavily focused on exports. Something like well over 3/4 of the food we produce goes overseas, and so industries such as kiwi fruits and wine, where the product that comes off the farm or the vineyard or the orchard actually ends up on the consumer's table, and apples as well. They're very consumer focused, and they were really interested in these systems to be able to show to consumers exactly what their sustainability level was. And other industries like dairy, where everybody's milk goes into the tank, and then it's heavily processed before it even gets to a consumer. There was, we really struggled for buy-in on that project.
Right. And so do you have the equivalent of kite marks or whatever it is on the products now?
No, we don't.
And do consumers really, are they really interested in?
Yeah, look, there was some really good marketing and economics and social science studies. Professor Caroline Saunders here, they undertook quite a large study looking at what we would call our mature markets. So that's places like the EU, the States, and Japan, and compared them with more emerging markets. So that was China, India, Korea, much to everybody's surprise, those developing markets, those newer markets, were far more interested in every aspect of sustainability, social sustainability, animal welfare than our mature markets. And it was a really big difference as well. And so again, one of the kind of debates that's kind of ending in New Zealand is, there's a lot of talk, we grow a lot of food and export it, and there's a lot of talk of feeding the world. We're increasingly clear in New Zealand, we're not here to feed the world. We grow enough food for 50 million people, and there's 7.5 plus now billion totally. And we increasingly want to grow food for rich people because they can pay more. And so our focus has increasingly shifted on, demonstrating social, environmental sustainability to our customers, because we will get a lot more money. The figure bandied around for Zespri and kiwi fruit is Zespri can put a physically identical kiwi fruit on a market, and compared to a competitor like Chile or Italy, we can get a 30% premium for a physically identical product because of the New Zealand backstory around sustainability.
Yeah, and so one of the challenges for New Zealand is making sure that it doesn't lose that clean green image.
Yeah, exactly. We have some very major risks. Ironically, compared to Europe, about the time that Europe really got on top of its nitrogen pollution and water problem, New Zealand started creating its own.
Yeah.
So we could have very clearly, and we, people were looking at Europe and going, we're going in completely the wrong direction here. So certainly for those industries with, very consumer, that are their products are right in front of the consumer, like, wine, apples, grapes, kiwi fruit. They're really concerned about that back issue and are working very, very hard to make sure their industries are as clean as possible. So they don't get caught out with issues like that.
Yeah, I mean, your water story, your water and lake story recently has, I imagine, made people very twitchy in New Zealand.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, as I come from England originally, I've used the comparison here. Growing up in the UK, you didn't go in the water for fear of your life.
Yeah.
If I'd grown up in New Zealand, you could have, jumped in the whatever water body you liked with no care in the world. And the opposite is true now. You can go swimming in the Thames in London and catch fish there, and you wouldn't put your dog in a whole load of water bodies in New Zealand because it'll die. There's been some major stuff ups over here.
yeah, that's right. I mean, I think that's because of, in part, it's because of not looking at the systems level, and also not necessarily looking at and that's largely where sustainability sits. It sits within that systems context, right?
Yeah.
Because of the three different pillars of the stool, sustainability stool.
Yeah, certainly. And I mean, a large part of it was, 20 odd years ago, there was a large push to increase exports, and they were basically commodities, and dairy was the most profitable at the time. And we put dairy cows in a whole load of places they should never have been in terms of the soils. And then added water as well, so there's a very clear finger pointing at one particular industry in New Zealand that wasn't consumer focused at all.
So James, where do you see Colorado heading? I mean, you're talking about a food system which is in effect heading more to local, and adding premium to local. Do you see that as where Colorado is heading, given the fact that probably the market is still very small for that within Colorado, and Colorado is, I imagine, as a state, an exporter of a lot of agricultural product?
Yeah, there's some significant challenges to it becoming something like, I'll go talk to wheat growers, and they'll say in 1 year they grow enough wheat for the whole entire city of Denver themselves. Just things like that. It creates something that it becoming just solely a regional food system, even though that's what a lot of these standards are really trying to incentivize, just doesn't make sense within the globalized food market. Just as Mirko was talking about, it's just that the economies have sort of developed around this export. So a lot of wheat is going to Europe or to various parts of Russia and things like that. So like that's like occurring right now. Same with, some of the stuff with, there's some industries that could be a little bit easier, such as peaches, for example. So the Western Slope, there's a lot of peaches grown here. There's some industries where it could work, but currently there's just significant challenges to it becoming some sort of sole regional food system. But then you get these questions like, should it be, should it be that way? Is there still a role potentially for a globalized food system? And what does that mean for these standards? Like I spent time in New Zealand. I thought about that a lot when I was down there. And Murph, I don't think we ever met, but I worked on the New Zealand Sustainability Dashboard project too. So I'm familiar with a lot of that work and overseer.
Yeah. Overseer, don't mention overseer to a farmer here.
Yeah. And I mean, I was really, it was very eye-opening in New Zealand, where I became much more sensitive to the role of exports and global agriculture. In Colorado, I was only just studying before, mostly like local food projects, urban agriculture or cooperatives, or trying to do things locally. And my mind wasn't in this space as much, particularly in a grounded sense, about the global food system. And in New Zealand, it really changed a lot of my thinking about these systems are in place, and they're like big ships that are hard to steer in a different direction.
And I've been thinking about those kind of local food systems, having been in organics most of my life and stuff, and strong focus on local food and stuff. You kind of start thinking back, a century or two, and you kind of go, well, everybody ate local, and there was quite a lot not to like about it. If you want to eat local in higher latitudes, you better like root vegetables over winter. Being kind of slightly facetious about it, but as well, in terms of actually stability of food supply, on a regular basis, growers in a particular area will have complete crop failures because of weather events. And before we had global trade in food, if that was the case, you basically started starving, or you had to switch to some other food, which in many cases was difficult. So while there's many, many problems with the global food trade, at the same time, in terms of bringing resilience and security to the food system at the same time, there's actually probably an awful lot to be said for it, And if you like bananas, don't live in northern latitudes because they're not local. So just the diversity of food we've been able to, ironically, while the actual diversity of food types in the food system has contracted massively over the last century, we do actually have access to a whole range of food types and foods that we wouldn't have otherwise, due to global trade. So classic double-edged sword, I think.
James, you've done a fantastic job at keeping the conversation going. So thanks very much indeed. It was really interesting to hear the way in which you're trying to bring the experiences that you had, for example, the New Zealand one, into the conversation around the Colorado food system, and to see the contextualization of place within that the food system that you talked about. I think that it'll become more and more of an issue as we go towards, that think global, eat local kind of idea for future ways in which agriculture engages with the great unwashed. So thanks very much indeed, and thanks, Murph, also for your strong contribution to this session. It's been really interesting to hear that.
Been very interesting conversations. Thank you very much.
Yeah.